Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of our Peak Intel, part of our Contest Prep University podcast. And this is where we dive a little bit deeper into some research, and we try to be a little bit more mindful of integrating specific topics with the full picture. And this one is on all the training variables. And Austin, I was looking through my own notes. I honestly have never had more notes sitting in front of me than any podcast I've ever done in my life. Because this is such a comprehensive topic. So you and I were joking before going on camera, like we're going to do all the things regarding training. A little dangerous. We could miss a few things, but I really think because we are in such a golden era of exercise science, that most people are going to be familiar with a lot of the concepts we discuss. But outside of some of the really more popular meta-analyses and some of the information, the biggest influencers in our industry, I think there still is some gray area and some nuance that people just don't seem to understand, and they don't know how to apply it to their own particular training. So I know some of the texts that you were looking at, and without knowing, beyond reasonable doubt, if you're going to go into different aspects of this, but training to failure is a big controversy right now. But if you look at all the variables and some of the other meta-analyses besides the classic Schoenfeld one, which is now classic, just a few years old, you have to look at total volume, you have to look at load, you have to look at frequency, perceived exertion or intensity. Some people define that different ways. You have powerlifted competitively. You are a pro bodybuilder. And first of all, in the research, that seems to be one bifurcation right away. If you train for a strength sport, this may not apply. Like there is some specific nuance to just specifically trying to get stronger. Of course, getting stronger for sport, but a lot of people listening to us are in it primarily for the physique sport angle, for hypertrophy. So that's my introduction, at least into what we're going to try to run through today. How do you look at this as a comprehensive topic?
It kind of in a way that I would say grew up through bodybuilding, because it was just purely hypertrophy, right? I mean, looking at Muscle and Fitness and all the hypertrophy little free workouts that they would put into there. But then as I started to get more into my bodybuilding career, powerlifting started to seem to take off, especially in like the natural world. And the reason I say that, Joe, is because a lot of like natural bodybuilders were like, I don't know what to do with my off season. Like I know I'm growing and I feel like I need something else. So there was a lot of crossover between a lot of natural bodybuilders getting into like natural powerlifting because it allowed them to kind of just see some objective progression, right? Like I'm getting stronger at some of these lifts and I can compete, but I don't have to be, you know, sub 8% body fat on the platform. So I kind of see it as a, kind of like you had mentioned, like where does the overlap exist with kind of maybe not necessarily a powerlifting, but kind of like a strength phase program in that realm? Where does it overlap with bodybuilding? How can both worlds benefit from one another? More so specifically, how can like the bodybuilding world benefit from some sort of strength-based tracking, if you will, and how does that crossover from the stage to the platform, or to the stage, excuse me.
Yeah, that is a very, very interesting angle because I obviously saw that surge. There were people who started competing in powerlifting and who even started moving their contest prep seasons further and further apart because they got so enthralled with powerlifting. And if we go down to the physiology, which, ironically, I wasn't even prepared to do today, and you look at a cross-sectional analysis of muscle fiber types, and going back to Physiology 101 in college in any exercise science or pre-med program, you learn that different types of stimulation can affect the cross-sectional diameter and strength of different muscle fiber types. And we always like to classically describe them as fast twitch or slow twitch and oxidative or not, and red muscle fiber versus white. And you learn that more of the postural muscles, which I am going to bring up in a German volume training study, but the ones that are more oxygen rich, that are posturally inclined, like your back muscles, your leg muscles, that they can respond differently to different muscle fiber training adaptations and specificities. And so when you get to more the fast twitch muscle fiber, like in biceps or so forth, which are evolved to just lift things briefly and with a little bit more load, they have a greater propensity for cross-sectional size. So powerlifting per se, something with a high load, short volume, they actually do increase hypertrophy quite a bit. So that's where powerlifting can come into play. And yet, a lot of times when you look at some of this research that is done in short increments, you're going to look at a lot of studies in exercise science that are 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, and you're never looking at what happened to a competitor or an athlete over 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. So go ahead if you don't mind. I know you looked at a Helms study, and I think that meta-analysis by Schoenfeld. What are your takeaways when you look at all of those variables, when you look at load, frequency, volume, and intensity?
Yeah, I mean, there was a reoccurring theme between both, and we had mentioned it briefly in the opening, is, when they looked at like load and frequency and all these things, they had found that like there wasn't really a significant difference between like individuals, when they're going into these sessions, um, training to absolute failure versus not training to failure. Like they saw there was a consistency of like those that trained to absolute failure versus those that stopped just shy of failure, excuse me, saw similar results as far as it coming to strength and hypertrophy. So, it was very interesting to see both studies kind of echo that within their research. And it makes a lot of sense because we are starting to see a lot more research coming out that we don't need to train to absolute failure. There is a time and a place. So we've talked about like powerlifting, right? There's a time and a place where it's, if you're going to design a program, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. This is relevant. If we're going to design a program, you might need to train to a 1 rep max to establish your 1 rep max to build your program around that, right? But that doesn't mean you have to walk into every single session thinking it has to be the death. And again, I know we're going to get into this subject later, but I'm going to bring it up. Is, there's a fine line, like kind of seeing the research a little bit. There's a fine line between training really hard, which you and I have preached and talked about. The intensity should be there, but it doesn't have to be to the absolute death or failure to achieve the results that we're looking for in the physique sport world. And this makes a lot of sense when we talk in terms of frequency, right? We have a lot of programs coming out now where people are wanting to train, more in the female divisions, want to train legs 3 times a week. It's going to be incredibly hard to recover if you're going to absolute failure all 3 times a week to get the most out of those workouts, which is trying to grow legs and glutes and so on. So kind of to give a very brief, summary of those two, that was a big similarity between those two research studies, excuse me. And I think those are things that we can kind of dive into.
Yeah, I think all of these overlap so much that it's not necessary to take them in a certain order. But you started with load, and I know that is an important part, because if you're going to walk into the gym for today's workout, what is the aim? What is the goal? And I also looked at a meta-analysis by Morton, Semple, and Stuart Phillips. I think a lot of people are familiar with Phillips in our industry. And they were looking at, as you described, both strength and hypertrophy, like how can we sort these things out? And they came to some conclusions, again, through a meta-analysis, spending a lot of time looking at all of the research that met their selection criteria, that if you never train greater than 85% of your 1 RM, then you're going to achieve the same thing. As a matter of fact, in some studies, when you equate for enough time, you could train with just 30 to 50% of your 1 rep max. I think this was for over 12 weeks, and literally move your strength up the same as if you were doing 5 single 1 RM sets per workout. So imagine the power lifter, imagine the 18 or 25-year-old going in the gym thinking every single workout you've got to max out, hit failure. And they love doing those singles, that heavy work. It's fun, right? Um, and yet somebody else comes along, trains the same length of time. They never go above 50% of their one rep max, but they're doing 8 to 12 reps, like the classic hypertrophy rep range. And they move their 1RM up just as similarly. So that's a huge hit against the felt need to train to failure. Because the closer you get to failure, that's where you get most of your risk of injury. So again, like some people would say, and I agree, if you love to train heavy, go train heavy. Like that's part of the draw of training is doing what you like. But if you're in it for longevity and you really don't want that risk, you simply don't have to. But then that gets into the question, what about that fast twitch muscle fiber if you're never training it? So there's another element to load that gets into, perceived failure, perceived exertion, and a real sweet spot that keeps coming up in the literature is when people hit volitional fatigue. Because we started looking at perceived exertion, not we, but as an industry back in the 60s. And I kind of thought Mike Zordos was the first one to make all this stuff up. And he was actually, just updating some tables and references that had been there and kind of forgotten when he was looking at one rep maxes and so forth, perceived exertion. And the person I keep coming back to this particular point, and I'll probably summarize it at the end. The person who never knew what they were doing in the gym, like think of a lifter in the 60s, the 50s that just didn't have the kind of exercise science and access to information we do, and that they still made tremendous results. They found a way because anecdotally, we know what works for us. And I don't want to stop there, of course. I mean, we're in this for the science. We want to understand what has been investigated, but there is so much gray area for how you apply it to yourself. And so even that concept of volitional fatigue, does somebody who's never trained before, they've never been part of a study, they've never been instructed on these kinds of concepts, and they just go in the gym, they lay down with a set of dumbbells for bench press, or they're in the squat rack, like when do they stop? What is their perceived exertion level where they hit that volitional fatigue? And it's usually within 1 to 3 reps of failure. That's just kind of innately there in what we perceive. And ironically, I think that's part of what you're seeing in some of those studies that you looked at with training to failure, is that how could you ever know if it was 1 or 2 or 3 reps shy? You just when you're getting that ball game. But I would caveat that with it's still going to be different for everybody. Like the amount of risk you're willing to take, the amount of breakage in form, the amount of perhaps pain you're willing to feel, that's where you could get up to 100% or more difference in what you would call a to RIR versus me calling that. So anything else on that load versus actual failure?
Yeah, more of like a tip to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying that might be helpful for somebody listening. Um, I had said earlier about like there's a time and a place for a 1RM, right? If we're going to try to do a program design, like, okay, I need to figure out this is what my one rep max is for, let's say, squat or maybe even a leg press, depending on the person. So this is where it's at now. I can design my program from here because I'm going to do this amount of percentage for this exercise for my training block. Okay. Well, when we're talking about like RIR and trying to figure out like what is like how do I know if I have like 2 or 3 reps in reserve? Before you get into a program design, it's okay to test that. Again, there's a time and a place for everything where it's like if you're going to do a dumbbell bench press, so do a dumbbell bench press and work up to a certain weight and kind of like you were saying, like figure out where you are absolutely struggling. Like I maybe have one more rep. We'll go for that one more rep and find out. Did you fail at that one rep? Okay, so that probably wasn't one rep in reserve if you failed and didn't get it, right? So that here's how I felt, leading up to that. It helps to just jot down like how you were feeling because as you said, like we eventually will just start to figure out what is that true one rep in reserve or 2 rep or whatever. Like So for maybe like a newer lifter or even an experienced lifter that's just not very familiar with RIR, it's all right to, before you start a new program, kind of experiment with what truly feels like a 1 rep, or a 2 rep or whatever. So you can start to develop, because it's, you and I, we're going to talk about the science today, but it's also hard to explain to somebody like, no, you had 2 more in you, right? So Joe and I ran an experiment like this when I was out visiting him. We did the leg press, right? Like we did a bunch of workup sets, and it's like we're going to get as many as we can. I think it was you got 15 and I got 14 at the same weight, but it was like, no, like there was nothing. Like we both agreed, like when I got off the leg press, we both like, you have nothing left in you. But we've trained for 20 years, you know what I mean? And so we've developed that. So somebody that maybe isn't used to that, you have to experiment a little bit to figure out what is that true 1 rep that you have, or that 2 rep or whatever. So I think that that can be a helpful tool for somebody listening.
Yeah, and I've actually trained for almost 45 years, so they're
I
a
was trying to
slight
be
difference
nice.
there, right?
I didn't want it. I didn't want to date.
Well, the important thing there is I'm certainly learning what variables are most important at this stage of my life, because 20 years ago when I was squatting and deadlifting 500 pounds, now it's just not, the risk of getting up even to three-fourths of that is greater on my skeletal structure than it was then. And so when I was 18, when I was 35, at 55 now, it is quite different. But at the same time, a lot of the physiology applies. For example, just in the last couple of months, I decided I wanted a little bit of an intensity gut check. And so I started doing German volume training for squats. I did about a 3-month run of that. And I wanted to see how I could raise my strength even through that system. 10 reps of 10 at about 60% of your 1 rep max. You're not getting anywhere close to a 1 rep max, but yet that amount of volume is something to behold. I mean, that's something you have to experience. And I say that because when you look at how some people have trained, like Tom Platz, who loved to train heavy, but he also had some insane volume exhibits, like some of the feats of strength he did on just intensity, like squatting, I think 225 for 100 continuous reps, something like that. Some people would ask, is there any value to that? Is that, quote, junk volume? I have a study later on I'll bring up that'll show, no, there's probably some value. It's not how you want to train every week. It's not how you want to train every progression or training block. But is there something to that intermittently interspersed would have some value? I think so, especially in the way that you create that nucleotide framework of the protein matrix, what becomes the actin, myosin, myofibrils, and so forth. Uh, the mitochondria and the efficiency of your mitochondria in the muscle, as well as the just sheer volume, it can be incredibly different person to person. So to this day, because I was always a high intensity, high volume trainer, I can still put most training partners on the floor in a leg workout. I don't even feel fatigued, and yet I can do that. Now, did that help me as a bodybuilder? Was that the end all be all of my development? I'll put some pictures. I'll make sure they are in the presentation here. So it didn't hurt me. I was kind of known for leg development, but was there a better way? That's where it becomes unfalsifiable, because we can never say in an N of one, in a case study of just me, I can't go back and relive the last 45 years of my training. So I can't say what would be better or not. But my point to all this is, over that amount of time, we've all experimented with a lot of training. And I think even if you overtrain, you probably accidentally had some bigger rest breaks and some time off to recover. And people who don't train hard enough, they probably were challenged at different times and increased their training load. So even if you have one single type of training style that seems to fit your personality and that's what you do over and over, given enough time, I think you're going to run into different forms of stimulus. But that goes into now, if we leave load and intensity and training to failure behind for a bit, you now have to jump into frequency and volume. And I know that's where a lot of these more current meta-analyses have spent some time is trying to answer this question. Number one question we get asked, how many times can I train my glutes? How many times can I, train chest? How many total sets per week is what it really kind of comes down to for most researchers. So what is your understanding of that right now? Total volume in a given amount of time?
It's actually a perfect lead in. I think it was the Helms study that I shared with you. It was either that one or another Helms study. It was one of them, but they looked at the frequency. And in short, I mean, the summary was the sweet spot was about 2 days a week of frequency training. So if you wanted to grow your legs or your glutes, they had found like training twice a week was kind of that sweet spot versus training 3 or 4 days a week. And I believe some of that is because of the way that you can approach training load and also for your recovery. I know you and I have talked about this a bit, where I'll just use like legs. I see a lot of leg day workouts right now that are, specifically like glutes, like 3 days a week, and glutes are always involved somehow. It's not a lot of glute work, but it's involved. And I think that personally is like the upper limit of you can get some growth from 3 days a week, but really, again, from that Helm study, they kind of showed more like two is that sweet spot. I think because you can program it as such where you can have a heavier day, so you're moving heavier weight, a little bit less volume, and then you can have like a lighter day where you're moving a little bit less weight but more total volume. So you can kind of stagger those a little easier. When you throw a third day in there, now you kind of have to be very specific of like how hard am I going to train because I need to have enough recovery. Um, you know, you had brought up junk volume. How much of it's going to be like volume that I'm getting a lot out of versus I'm just doing volume because I just want to do it. I like to train it. I'm not saying that there's not some value there psychologically, but I think just based on some of the research that I have been looking at and just from my own personal experience, like 2 days a week, I think is best and is optimal. I used to train when I had a more flexible schedule, every muscle group twice a week. I wanted to bring up kind of everything. And then as I started to get feedback, I noticed everyone's like, your legs are great, but you got to bring up your upper body. So I then switched to doing legs just once a week. That might not be the case for somebody else, but if someone's trying to bring up a leg and body part, I think based on like research, 2 days a week, kind of alternating maybe a heavy and a heavier day and then a higher up day is kind of the nice sweet spot.
Well, so yes, and I think that's perfectly said because even in a researcher like Brad Schoenfeld, Phillips, people who have been in it forever, like this is their career, and so in their brains and their notes, they have cataloged every study that you and I could never even know existed. And in research criteria for the selection of studies you're going to put in a meta-analysis, you're really looking at the ones that fit a certain set of variables that you want to investigate. Are they close enough that they can merit being in the same, conversation? And you do come up with some generalities with enough studies like that. A sweet spot is 2 times a week. In the Schoenfeld meta-analysis, I believe he said if you're a novice, if you're kind of new to lifting your first couple years, you may benefit from a little more frequency because training load, the amount that you can physically put through your body, isn't as high. Your maybe total volume per workout is a little bit lower. So again, equating for total volume per week, maybe you can train 3 to 4 times per week. But then you get a little bit more advanced, and maybe it's 2 to 3. Then you get really, really advanced, and it might be just 1 to 2. So you get back to that sweet spot of two being kind of the overlap. But imagine somebody who has been training for 20 years, and I know you can squat 500-600 pounds. The amount of sets it takes to kind of warm up and get into the muscle tissue, and then you're doing that. Krieger did a what I would call kind of a famous study now, looking at single set or multiple set design. Do you need multiple sets, even multiple exercises per muscle group per workout? And of course, getting a little bit more into the muscle, so to speak, by doing multiple sets, there's also a sweet spot there. So kind of the single set to failure, heavy duty kind of training is one of the things he was trying to investigate. And it's like, no, you really need at least 2 to 3 sets. But then you get 4 or 5 sets in and you may start hitting the law of diminishing returns. So there's kind of an overlap or a sweet spot there as well. And studies show that, again, equated for total volume, even if you just train one time a week, there is virtually zero difference. So you really get to train to your preference. And I want to take that back as a contrast to me at 25 years old versus me at 55. When I was training aggressively and heavy, I'll explain my training a little bit later. There's no way I could recover to train legs twice a week. It just wouldn't happen. Like I'm still, deeply sore. Was that necessary? Could I have broken it apart? A little less volume per workout, a little less soreness? Absolutely. But research shows that what I did then was okay. Now, I just don't have quite the orthopedic tolerance for as much volume. And working around chronic injuries, tendons, joints, things like that, then it makes a lot more sense to all of a sudden say, wow, if equated for volume, I really have my choice. Now I can train a little less heavy, a little less volume, but a little more frequently. I've slowly transitioned to that, and I'm finding that maintaining my lean body mass and strength is perfectly fine. Like there is literally almost no difference. So perhaps your time of life, time of training, orthopedic history, you may find yourself leaning toward one or the other. But that in this particular Phillips meta-analysis, they also said greater than 10 sets per week was kind of the beginning threshold, less than 20, so around 15 work sets per week. That's really not a lot. Austin, if you mentioned some people want to train, pretty solidly 3 times a week per body part. How could you only get 15 to 20 total sets? Like, does that mean an awful lot of people are still overtraining?
Yeah, I think it very well could be. Because again, and I mentioned this earlier, like psychologically that might be okay, right? We can dive in later about, do you really need a pump to generate results? I still think that that exists in some people's mindsets, and I think that's where some of this training 3 times a week. Some people just love a good leg quad pump. Some people love a glute pump, and they're trying to grow, so they just think more is better. And so I struggle to believe that if we know the sweet spot's 15 sets a week, that we're gonna just go into the gym and do 5 hard sets per day on legs and then move on. I've never seen that. Like in the gym with people that have sent me their past programs, I've never seen it. It's usually like each like if they're doing 3 leg days, it's like maybe 10 sets. So now they're doing 30 sets a week, right? And I don't know, is it to the death on all of those 10 sets per day that they're training those legs? Or is it just kind of like, I'm coming in, I'm kind of going through the motions. It was kind of hard. I sweat a little bit. I got a nice pump though, so I think I did okay. And that's where I kind of think, again, psychologically, if people like to have a pump that makes them happy, it makes them feel good. You should enjoy training. There's a big benefit to that. Does that mean it's getting you results? Not necessarily. This brings me back to the very beginning. I'll just touch on a brief where I think the world of like powerlifting or strength sports specific, kind of tracking your strength can be beneficial if you know that you're doing like 2 days a week, and let's say you've got a heavier day that you're moving heavier weights, and then you've got your lighter day. I think if you can see that your lighter day, your less weight, if that strength is going up, that is worth tracking, right? So you're kind of having the heavy day helping build your lighter day. And right, when we're talking in terms of hypertrophy, if we can get the lighter weights to go up and we're lifting higher reps, that's just one approach. I'm not saying that's the approach, but I think that that's where tracking some strength can be helpful versus just coming in and saying, I'm going to do all these different exercises because I want to make sure this is working my upper glute. I need to hit upper glute like this. I need to hit my medial glute this way. I need to do this. So my point is, I think, I do believe that there's some people still overtraining. It's funny that you mentioned, kind of in the beginner phases with like training and getting into more advanced, because I have been kind of experimenting to do 12 to 15 sets per week now of muscle group. Because when I first started out at 18 years old, getting ready for my first show between 18 and like 25, it was like I was always training to the death. Like that's just how I knew. That's just, what I thought you had to do at the time. It was just crawling out of the gym. And now it's like I'm still training really hard, but I'm also doing it in a way where it's like, well, I don't need to do 30 sets a week anymore. I need maybe 12 to 15 really hard sets. And I kind of like that because that makes me think when I'm going to the gym, every set has to matter. You mentioned junk volume, right? Well, I think that's just become a new term now where people are talking about, do you need to do all these extra sets? Like, are you really getting anything out of it? If you know that like 12 to 15 is where we're seeing a lot of research is beneficial, per week, mind you, you really got to make sure that you're treating every set appropriately and designing your program appropriately, kind of, based on some of the variables we've discussed. So that's kind of my thoughts on people still overtraining and kind of how some of the things we've already talked about could be beneficial in approaching their program.
That's a really good thing to remind people is track these metrics very carefully. I have a box of binders in my office closet from my earliest training days. And when you look at me tracking my strength progression and so forth, like all of that is there, not because I need it now, but it's because I needed it then. Like I could really track my objective progress. But for example, going back to the difference between somebody who's just getting started and somebody who's more advanced, um, I started my career in professional physique sport. At the same time, I was an orthopedic physical therapist and just getting started as a strength and conditioning coach. And one of the things that we learn in orthopedics and rehab is what's called the Carr and Shepherd. It was, a couple of physical therapists back in the day who wrote a textbook on how you take some elements of lifts out to work on isolating parts of the kinetic chain and then integrate them back in. So you can think of kind of isolated muscle movement versus compound movements. And you're trying to make sure there's no weak links in that kinetic chain. And then you build up to the point where you've got stronger, more efficient, productive, gross motor patterns. And I guess a good way to try to get this point across is if somebody just had a total knee replacement, let's say they're 60 years old, they're laying in a hospital bed, for them to just sit in the bed and do terminal knee extensions, maybe 10 reps, 3 sets, they could do that 3 times a day because there's no load. There's just no load there. And then all of a sudden, you've got them doing it over the bed with an ankle weight. And then they're walking and then they're squatting. Pretty soon, you want less and less frequency because you've got greater and greater load. So one 2016 study from Thomas and Burns compared training 3 times a week with 3 good sets. So that's 9 sets versus training once a week with all 9 sets. The amount of muscle gain was identical. So imagine again, you could train 3 times a week, train your glutes 3 times a week, train your bench press 3 times a week, or train it once a week. But with total volume, the output was identical. So again, it comes down to your choice. Um, but if you're going to train multiple times a week, I'm not sure if anything in the research goes into this much specificity, but is there a difference in the types of exercise you use? Uh, now we're getting into angles and the closed pack position of joints and the way muscles contract, a little bit more of the physiology. Those are some of the things that are more difficult to find in research. But what are your thoughts on that? If you're going to train chest 3 times a week or legs 3 times a week, how are those workouts going to look compared to each other?
Yeah, I haven't seen as much on the different angles. There is some research that's come out a little bit. I haven't seen a ton of it where um, hitting muscle groups such as like in like the shortened or lengthened phase, it does appear that there is some benefit of training muscle groups in um, some of those phases. If I remember, I think it's some of them more in the lengthened phase can be slightly beneficial. Um, but compared to just full range of motion, I don't think it was significantly better. It was just that there was, potentially some benefit to it. So, as far as like a program, like I'm going to try to, if I'm training chest twice a week, I'm going to hit upper chest and lower chest on this day, and then just hit overall chest. I haven't seen a ton of research that states that there's anything different more than what you've said is if you're going to split it up, you're just splitting up muscle groups. And having it more kind of tailored of you're not doing the same load on each day. You're kind of splitting that load up a little bit. And then again, of course, I'm going to keep talking about recovery, making sure that you're recovering enough in between those 2 days or 3 days, if you will. I think one thing too, since we've been talking about training, and I think there's a little bit of research on, you might be more familiar with than I have. I tried to look, I couldn't find a ton, but I think some things that are missed as well, even in the physique sport world, and you and I have talked about this in the workouts that we've done, is incorporating unilateral exercises, focusing on time under tension type of training as well. I think those things are variables that can be added in a program that can be beneficial as well. Have you seen a lot of research on that?
Well, one of the things that does happen is greater time under tension is now just greater work. So when you're looking at total volume, that kind of goes under that category. And you're right, more emphasis on like the eccentric contraction and that sort of thing, a very slow negative, even overloading that phase of a contraction. You are doing more mechanical fiber disruption, which is a really good thing I wanted to throw into this conversation. You mentioned a few minutes ago also talking about, if you're only doing a certain amount of volume in a workout, are you going to get that feeling? Are you get that pump that you're chasing and that sort of thing? And to be honest, that's where a lot of this conversation comes down to is that perceived feeling of was this a quote good workout or not? This is why things like all the way back to the Nautilus, studies in the 60s, where it's like if you just train really hard, one set, like warm up, do what you need, but then just one set to failure. And then, of course, Mike Menser and Dorian Yates kind of picked it up in the 80s and 90s. Uh, you're looking at mechanical tension, muscle fiber disruption. And that's one of the things that Krieger was looking at. Prager when he was looking at one set versus multiple sets, and they showed that one set you really get the vast majority of the progress, but it's not all the progress you can get. If you're going to do one set, two sets, three sets, four sets, five sets, I've heard Eric Helm use this example in lectures, and then your sixth set and your seventh set, like let's say you're going to do 8 total sets of squats and your eighth set was to failure. Your first set was just your warm up set. Which one of those sets do you think you got the most benefit from? Most people in the room always say, well, the eighth set, because that was the heaviest set. He said, no, it was your first set. The first set you do gets you almost all of the way there. Then your second set gets you a little further. Your third set gets you a little further. Then all of a sudden in your fourth and fifth set, you see a little bit of attrition of gain, attrition of stimulus. And that's because you have mechanically disrupted that muscle tissue as much as you can, also chemically, also hormonally. The metabolic disruption to the energy systems in that muscle tissue are also being taxed. So that's a little bit of what's happening under the hood. When we're talking about going to the gym, how do we feel? What percent load are we using? How many sets? How many reps? We like to try and put all these things in metrics and categories we can just quantify in our training journal. But what's really happening is how we're impacting the physiology. And if you think of the mechanical strain and the hormonal or metabolic, I think that's where you can say, okay, I definitely need this many sets. But once I know I'm in that range of volume and I've hit it really, really hard, the stimulus has occurred. I can go home. If I'm training for long-term progress in how I look, strength, etc., the progress was done. I can go home. So now I can come do this again in 2 or 3 days. That's where you can get better frequency or higher frequency, I should say. But if you keep going and you just get more sore, and you are already at 98% and now you go to 100%, but now you can't train for 5 or 6 more days, did you really do yourself any favors? This goes into the category of the people who like to train more often. If you're going to train more often, you want to train more often without overtraining, absolutely stop when you know you got the stimulus you needed. And I don't care how you feel, how much of a workout, you said maybe you didn't even sweat that much. That's okay if that's your goal, but then you need to track those metrics.
Yeah, going back to tracking again, I do see some people, using pen and paper, which is nice. I like to use pen and paper myself when they track like their training. Some people now use apps to track their training and how much they're lifting, but I think that's a big missing link. If you're not tracking, then how do you know if you are progressing? There's a difference just going into the gym and killing ourselves, which is, again, that's fine. Like if you're talking overall health, but if we're talking about progress, we're trying to get stronger, we're trying to build our physique. We do need some objective information, and one of those pieces of the objective information is total volume over a weekend. Are we progressively getting stronger over time? It may not be per week, it might be per month, but we're getting stronger. And if we're doing that and we're training appropriately for like enough of frequency and things like that, like we can start to establish and see things differently. One thing I know you and I have talked about recently in the D1 club was the body fat percentage analysis, and you shared a really good example of Brian Whitaker, and that kind of I think is relevant to what we're talking about now because you shared a picture of him back in I think it was 2003 and how he looked and where he was at in 2015, and his body weight and body fat was almost the same, but his years of training, that's the one of the big factors, right? It was a 12 years of hard training and intense. Like there's some value in that. So I kind of bring that up because there's going to be people that are like, well, I'm getting stronger, but I just can't tell, right? I can't tell if my physique's looking any different or not. Well, if you've been doing this consistently for 12 years and you're tracking, you're doing things right, you can compare your physique from 12 years ago to now, and you will look different, and your body weight or composition may not be that much different. So I think that's an important thing to kind of discuss too for people listening that, aren't like doing powerlifting in the off season, like I talked about, like a lot of people like to do, or they're not training for anything in the off season. They're just going into training, right? And they're kind of like, I'm not really sure. I think I'm doing everything right, but how can I physically tell that I'm, seeing any results? So I think that's worth kind of mentioning.
Yeah, and that's where, as I always say, that this sport is measured in decades, not workouts in weeks. And that's where you really see that long-term difference. But let me cover a couple little studies that will provide some of the nuance that I mentioned. There was one in 2017 comparing German volume training on hypertrophy and strength versus modified German volume training, which is classified as basically just doing half of the volume. So German volume training, as I said earlier, 10 sets of 10 reps at about 60% of your 1 RM. Of course, half of that would be 5 sets. And here's what's interesting. They show, well, first of all, they did this a little bit differently because GVT is classically done on the big lifts, like squat, bench, deadlift. They did this on bench, leg press, and lat pull down for some various reasons. It gives you some context is different, but what they found with 6 weeks and 3 sessions per week, the 5-set group, people who are doing half of the normal German volume, increased their total mass by 3.5%. The 10-set group, only 2%. And the actual lean body mass, which is more important, in the 5-set group was 2.7%, and the 10-set group 1.9%. So both increased lean body mass. And these are in kilograms, or I'm sorry, percentage. But the 5-set group actually had the advantage. So 2% in the 10, 2.7 in the 5-set group. But there was some difference. And here's what happened. So even like, I mean, they weren't doing individual exercises. That this was bench press, right? But the tricep, for example, gained more lean body mass in the 10-set group. And in the quads, they kept up almost the same. So again, now we're back to that slow twitch muscle fiber that posturally is better oxygenated anyway, so they can withstand a little bit more volume. But the overall, kind of take home to this is you only needed half the volume. You actually got overall net better gains with half the volume instead of going to 10. Have you ever done German volume training yourself?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of a gut check. I mean, did you ever feel like I'm doing this to gain muscle size or anything, or was it more just kind of a bravado, like this is a great workout?
I was curious on how effective it was and just the physical challenge of it. So I used it morally for squats, similar to what you've done. So, and it is a gut check. I mean, in the beginning, it took me a little bit. I was like, I don't know if I'm doing this the right way. But then once I've kind of found my groove, it was like, yeah, this sucks. This is terrible. I uh, would do it in kind of a timed fashion. I know you've kind of discussed that as well. Or I'm like, okay, I have only a certain amount of time and I have to get this done. And that's where I found like that worked better for me.
Hmm. Yeah, and again, I think the important message there is the muscle tissue that is evolutionarily more favorable toward volume, you can use more volume. That makes sense. But I would say, just on a practical standpoint, some of my best workouts throughout my entire life are when I'm pressed for time, because now I have to be more efficient. I have to be more productive. I have to make the decision like, okay, was that enough? I need to move on to the next exercise. And I'm not languishing around in just some of those junk volume ranges, just thinking, quote, this is a great workout. I'm blasting this muscle group. And so I feel better about it. Man, when you can get in there and just get that done, I think that's much more favorable. But here's the thing about something like the German volume training. Recently, when I did it, I started out with 135 pounds, and I didn't even know if that was 60% of my one rep max. I just wanted to make sure I was safe and had a good platform. So I did 10 sets of 10, great. Added 20 pounds the next week, great. Added 20 pounds, added 20 pounds, added 20 pounds. Pretty soon, I'm up to 200 pounds. Maybe it was even 225 for 10 sets of 10. And that's when I decided to start including that time element, which is I want to get this done under 20 minutes. So now I literally have less than a minute to rest between sets. My last day of doing that, again, I think it was maybe 200 pounds. I did 10 sets of 10 in 17 and a half minutes. So it's virtually just enough time to, go get a sip of water and get your heart rate, down 15, 20%. Um, And what's fantastic is there was physical change in my body. Like I was so much better than when I transitioned to a different training block into different styles of training. So that was almost a planned overreach. Perhaps even toward the last couple workouts, a planned overtraining so that I could deload a little bit and transition and carry that benefit of what I was doing into something else. So if we go back to how there is some preference to this, uh, when you are training yourself or programming for a client, you probably have some kind of non-linear training methodology. Like you just don't say, okay, do this exercise in this way, in this pattern for the next 12 or 16 weeks. How do you undulate that week to week or workout to workout? Or if coming back to even inside a single week, what are the things you're trying to do that are outside of load, frequency, and volume? Because we talked briefly about like the angle and the type of movement, but if we're looking at an incline chest fly versus an incline barbell bench or something else, I mean, do you find that it's just gross stimulation of the muscle tissue, or do the types of movements really matter?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes and yes. I'd say a bit of both. Uh, because there's also people out there, right? Like if I have clients, like they just sort of like, I don't feel this movement. I don't really feel like I'm supposed, and so that's kind of when you're doing online programming for people, that's kind of hard to explain. I can send videos, I can, do form checks, but if they can't feel it, then I have to look to an alternative route. So that plays a factor there. And that alternative route is like, how about this? Do you feel this a little bit better here? Yes, yes, I do. Okay, so that's important. That's an important piece to that puzzle. So now, we might use that instead. So for example, a lot of my clients would probably get more out of an incline dumbbell fly than an incline dumbbell bench. Actually, they'd probably get more out of a decline. And I know you and I have talked about the decline presses and flies for a reason, targeting more chest than people think. So I do look at the angles and what they bring because do some different movements bring value. You and I've trained legs a few times together. I'm big with unilateral work, meaning a lot of my clients hate me for this too. You're always going to do a lunge or a split squat, or you're going to do some single leg movement for a couple of reasons, right? Like I want to make sure, like we're physique sport and we need to be balanced on both sides. I want to make sure that we're focusing on single leg stuff. So one leg looks a little bit better than the other, or not the better, looks similar to the other leg. I want to do that. I want to make sure that we're still focusing on some functional sides of things. I want to make sure that we're functional people. We've got good balance. We've got good stability. That does have some carryover to other big lifts. And then you're also just targeting things a little bit differently, right? Some people might not be comfortable doing like a heavy barbell squat. I can get them to do a heavier Bulgarian split squat. I can get them to do a heavier goblet squat, and they'll still get a lot of benefits from that. So there are some variables that I look at, mostly dependent on my client, but I also look at the type of exercise and what it's going to be bringing to that muscle. And to what you said earlier, it's not going to be the same thing for 12 weeks. It'll be like, here we're doing this for 4 weeks and kind of here's why, here's how the approach is. And then the next 4 weeks, it might be targeting that same muscle, but it might be something just slightly different. And here's why. So that's the approach that I'll take with my clients.
Yeah, some of my original strength and conditioning precepts were developed from some of the work of William Kramer back in the 70s and 80s. And ironically, everybody knows me for nutrition. That's what I've done with most of my career. My first doctorate was in nutrition, then a second health education. But as an orthopedic physical therapist and a certified strength and conditioning specialist, I was really interested in that more than anything. And it's still not just part of my formative career, but to this day, the things we're talking about now, you and I going into the gym, doing this for the love of the sport, for just pure movement and the physiology of that, that's what carries us through. And a lot of my best training was done in a classic undulating periodization model where I would break it up into weeks. And so 1 week was primarily a strength week. And then the next week was more of a higher intensity, higher volume week. But that allowed me to stagger the recovery. And now a lot of people, because of this current research, shorten that into an interweek split. So all of what I would do in 2 weeks, because I was training with more volume per session, people are training with less duration per session, but more frequency. So now it's kind of compressed. I think that's where my biggest hangup is for most people. They're still trying to do too much volume in a single week versus a 2 week stretch. But when you can do that, when you think of how I juxtapose strength work, the kind of loads we're talking about, and then even the angles of movement, then you can squeeze in more training. For example, if my first movement of this week for back is primarily rowing, and I'm maybe adding another body part in with that workout, but I'm really stimulating. Remember the mechanical and metabolic stimulative effects. So I maximize that and then I get out. Well, then 2 or 3 days later, maybe I can do some pull over and pull down movements. And then maybe my third back workout of that week, if I'm doing it 3 times, maybe it's deadlifts, where it's more of a compound movement. I can do all of that in one back workout in a week, but I can also split it up into 2 or 3, just depending on if I'm going to really honor the physiological principles of recovery. And this was maximum stimulation. I'm going to put it on the shelf and be done until my next workout. Again, I'm gravitating more toward that higher frequency now because I've been interested in the new research and I want to test it out. And unable to falsify this against my 25 or 35-year-old self, I am finding I like it more now because I'm not tiptoeing over that line of risk and greater injury. But I'm curious, somebody like yourself at 35 in your physical orthopedic prime, which one do you feel you like the most, and which do you get the best results from? You mentioned that you have reduced volume a little bit, but are you training more frequently per workout? Are you still getting 2 workouts per body part per week?
Due to my schedule, no. So in a way, I kind of liked that because like I'm pressed for time. So I train super early in the morning. I got about 60, 70 minutes tops to get my workout in, which by the time I get to the gym, I do a little bit of just kind of stretch and warm up quick because it's 4 o'clock in the morning and I just need to warm up a little bit at that early in the morning to lift. Um, I have time to hit everything once a week, basically. So again, for my ego a little bit, that's hard because I've always been like leg dominant. So for years, I've spent trying to build my upper body. So I appreciate the training I did when I was younger because it was just, again, it was heavy and hard, and it aligns with the research, right, that they've looked at where you might need more volume in your earlier years of lifting. I definitely fell into that category. But now that I've got more years of training under my belt, I like that I guess I call it some pressure. I like having a little bit of pressure where it's like you don't have as much time as you used to, and both from a time standpoint in the gym and the amount of time throughout the week to get your workouts done. So you need to maximize when you're going into the gym, and it makes me push myself hard. But I feel like with like my recovery and just my overall strength, I feel like I've been able to achieve more. Which, if you would have told me that at 21, it would have been I mean, I love science, so I would have probably been like, oh, that makes sense, but I probably wouldn't have listened to you because I'm like, I just love training this way. Where now it's like I have had multiple times in my 30s squatting and deadlifting over 300 pounds, but I'm doing nowhere near the volume that I used to. I remember when daily undulating periodization was incredibly popular and boomed, and people out there, including myself, were doing like 7 sets of two on squats. I've been able to achieve just as much strength doing half that volume now. And I understand, I can appreciate, I like to test things out. Like I said, I like science, so I'm not afraid to try different training methods to see if there's a lot of legitimacy here. But I would say over the past between like 30 and 35, I've drastically cut down my volume, but I've made sure I'm getting a lot of bang for my buck every time I go into the gym, and I've just had a lot of success with it. So maybe it's just because of the point in my life that I'm at right now. I like it and I enjoy it. But I definitely wouldn't say I'd go back and change how I trained then because it probably wouldn't have led me to where I'm at now. So
Well, I'm going to finish up with this play off of what you just said, in that we all carry our own biases into this, and that's what I always try to check. And I think of current clients who are just getting in the sport and in the game, and they have kind of a blank slate approach of like whatever you tell me is, or whatever the science shows, like that's what I'm going to do. I think people are more willing today to specify movements in their workouts. So when you looked at the actin, myosin, the Z-line contractions, just a gross muscle fiber contraction, what happens? That stimulation mechanically is so generic, and yet the tiniest little angle pull, like if I'm, as you said, doing a decline bench press for my chest, or I'm doing a weighted barbell hip thrust for my glutes, but then I add a band, so I'm now focused on external rotation force while I'm extending my hips, that kind of thing. You add all these little variables, or it's a one-legged, so now I'm using the small rotational muscles of my hip versus, the glutes. All these tiny little things make changes in the exercises, and that's where you can say, okay, this, if you're going to do glutes, for example, 3 times a week as part of your leg training, like here's where you're going to do the heaviest lever movements, stiff-legged deadlifts, hip thrusts, squats. Over here, we're going to do more rotational stuff. Here's a little bit more high volume, lower load. And so you tell a client these days, or an athlete, that that's going to be the plan. And they're like, okay, I'll do that. And they're not necessarily chasing the great workout and feeling totally blitzed every particular workout. But I think it's still important to look at the classic training recovery XY axis. Here's where you get that mechanical and hormonal metabolic disruption. Then you need a certain amount of recovery time to come up, and then you get that super compensatory effect. And you have to always try to hit it at the top of that recovery cycle. If you're hitting it below that, you're just going to grind yourself into overtraining in less results. So I mean, I knew we were going to come up with anything revolutionary. We just wanted to cover what everybody is talking about and explain how it impacts the practical nature. But my take home from this, especially in how I'm applying it now, is there is very little difference in effect, no matter how you split up the volume. Train 1 to 3 times a week per body part, depending on how much volume you want, how much intensity and load you want, but monitor that recovery, and perhaps even start looking more carefully at the training angles, the exercise selection, and even the muscle fiber type. Because as I said in that German volume study, those more postural muscles that are evolutionarily capable of higher loads, maybe that is a chance that you want to apply a little bit more volume. But anything you want to say as a summary yourself, Austin?
Not really. I mean, you summarize it pretty well. I think people, I want to challenge people listening to actually try what we're saying, because I'm sure there's going to be some people that listen to this that are currently doing like 3 days a week or whatever. And like we said, that's fine, but try changing your program to some of the things we've talked about and see, document, compare. Did you notice that you were getting more benefits from 3 days a week, or are you getting just as much from two? You may surprise yourself. And if it is 3 days a week, great, but at least you tried something different. It uh, it forces people to change a little bit, which change can be uncomfortable. I've had to do that multiple times in my training years, but I have found great success in, changing, as I get older. Because again, our personal lives change a little bit, our schedules change, and you might be doing the same thing that you've been doing because you enjoy it, which I said earlier is fun, but try something different to see if you are getting more out of it, because you might be just spinning in the same hamster wheel. So that's my only little thought to the end here.
All right, guys. And once again, this Peak Intel is part of our contest university universe in terms of the things that we provide in content. We also have something that Austin mentioned earlier, our Contest Prep University D1 Club, which is a private group where even if you have a coach or you coach yourself, you can be in this group where you're just getting people like Austin, myself, Adam Atkinson, our medical director, Dr. Jennifer Souders, people like that who can help with your journey. So many different ways, but message us if you have any questions. And as always, we'd love to see this conversation continue if you have any thoughts with your own training. We'll see you next time in Contest Prep University, Peak Intel.